could start the recording. Got it. So this is an event that is sponsored. And let me just share my screen first. And first, thank you all for being here. It really is a pleasure to have as many people joining us for the session. Just wanted to do a full presentation. By way of just housekeeping, for those who are just joining us, we're taping the session. And this is an event that is sponsored by the Faculty of Education's Equity or Equitable Leadership Network, or ELN. It's a network of professors and graduate students, and it aims at mobilizing knowledge on anti-racism, equity, social justice, and educational practices. Before I begin, let me say, oui, nous rendons hommage au peuple algonquin, gardien traditionnel de cette terre. Nous reconnaissons le lien sacré de longue date l'unissant à ce territoire qui demeure non cédé. Nous rendons également hommage à toutes les personnes autochtones qui habitent Ottawa, qu'elles soient de la région ou d'ailleurs au Canada. Nous reconnaissons le gardien et les gardiennes et gardiens des savoirs traditionnels de tout âge, de tous âges. Nous aurons aussi leurs dirigeantes et dirigeants d'ailleurs, d'aujourd'hui et de demain, au courage indéniable. With no translation, we paying homage to the land. In his address to Stanford University in 1967, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. explained that America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, had worked so very well for so many people and became a brilliant place for so many. However, he was not interested in this America. He worked tirelessly until his last breath to expose the other America, the one that is doomed for a continuous and infinite struggle, the America that people prefer not to talk about. Like Offred in Margaret Atwood's novel, The Handmaid's Tale, who gave birth out of frustration. So we too introduce, and out of that book came the event, introduced this book, which will be the kernel, will be the main point of the discussion today. We too introduced this book, Out of Frustration. We did a little bit of homework. In fact, not a little bit, quite a bit of homework. And we found that a few, if not almost none, talking about the other America from Black professors' perspective. As far as we know, this is the first, and by way of introducing the book, first comprehensive coast-to-coast book that deals with the topic of what it means to teach, learn, and research while Black. That is what it means to be Black, quotation or bracket, and professor in the Canadian Academy. Our thinking has always been that the struggle is out there, outside the academy. After all, we have PhDs, and we are highly civilized, educated, and intellectual. Through this book, we are flipping the script. The struggle is no longer over there. The struggle is right here in the academy, which is sometimes a very ugly, inhumane, and extremely unhealthy place. After all, and this is from my own perspective, I know one and I mean overqualified Black professor at the University of Ottawa, airing on our Jerry Linen, who was not awarded a university chair which was going to focus on Black studies in University of Ottawa, which does not exist, focusing particularly within the Black youth. And the chair was awarded to someone who will be doing blended learning. Let me pause, blended learning. So reading from the blurb of the book, which can be accessed through the University of Toronto Press, the essays, and I'm not going to read the whole thing. This is just what you have on the slide before you. The essay in the nuances of Blackness in the academy make visible the submerged stories of Black life in academia. They offer, and these are the essays, they offer fresh historical, social, and cultural insights into what it means to teach, learn, research, and work while Black. And I'm not going to read the second paragraph. Just have it in front of you. With no further ado, we have 4 presenters. Each of the 4 will present a section from the book. And then Nambusu Delamini of York University and Gina Teze of Université de Québec, Montréal will offer their comments on the book. Gina has actually a chapter in the book, but she will speak to the struggle of Blackness in the Francophonie in general. Each will take about 5 minutes. Then very kindly, and this is just by way of housekeeping, if you can pose your questions in the Q&A or in the chat, and Lisa very kindly will actually kind of sift through the questions, and I will then either pose the questions or ask Lisa to read them. But for now, we will do the presentation and then the Q&A. We will start with Handel Wright of UBC. He is a professor of education and the senior advisor of the president on anti-racism and inclusive excellence. Then we will move to the second part of the book, which will be presented by Melinda Smith of the University of Calgary. She's a professor of political science and vice provost and associate vice president research on equity, diversity, and inclusion. Followed by Tamari Ketosa. He's an associate professor in sociology department at Brock University. And then myself, Awad Ibrahim, professor at the Faculty of Education, University of Ottawa. Handel, the floor is all yours. And if you want me, I could just go back to the, I think I should just be able to go back. If you want to leave this as you present your part, you can. Otherwise, I will just stop sharing.
I'm fine either way, Awad. I guess you could stop sharing. Yeah.
Okay. I think the focus will be on you better that way. I appreciate that.
So thanks very much, Awad. My name is Handel Kashope Wright. I'm the inaugural senior advisor to the president of UBC on anti-racism and inclusive excellence, and the director of the Center for Cultural Identity and Education, and a professor in the Department of Educational Studies here at UBC. I want to start by acknowledging that the UBC's campuses are situated on the traditional unceded territory of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh, and on the territory of the Silix Okanagan Nation. I will start off with the discussion of the first section of the text. A basic premise of our collection of essays, The Nuances of Blackness in the Canadian Academy, is that the university in Canada was built on and for and remains the Eurocentric world of middle-class male whiteness. The very existence and indeed proliferation of positions and offices of indigeneity, gender, anti-racism, equity, and diversity are progressive steps that nonetheless prove the perennial nature of the problem of exclusion of indigenous and racialized peoples and other ways of knowing well into the 21st century. This text is comprised of 4 sections, each consisting of an introductory commentary followed by several essays. I will speak to the first section, which is titled Blackness, What's in a Name? In his introductory commentary on this section of the book, George Safer Day of the University of Toronto draws on Fanon and Du Bois to signal our text's approach of complexity and unity without resort to prescription. As he puts it, quote, "Blackness is too rich to be contained by a singular narrative and to be written about and from a single playbook," end quote. So who is the Black academic and how are we positioned in the Canadian Academy? How do we conceptualize ourselves and Blackness into existence? As Awad mentioned in his introduction. In my own cultural studies contribution titled The Awkward Presence of Blackness in the Canadian Academy, I assert a corollary premise to the whiteness of the Canadian University, namely that Blackness is rendered an awkward presence. The Black body, a body out of place on campus. The Black academic, the unexpected professor, out of place in front of the class. The Black student, ultra visible by being the sole Black person or one of very few in the classroom. Black academic is a necessarily political articulation that refuses gender and sexuality binaries and includes continental African Canadians and Caribbean double diasporic subjects, immigrants from the US, and Blacks whose presence stretch back to the era of enslavement and the so-called settlement of Canada. Our contribution to inclusive excellence, I conclude, should involve collaboration with progressive others, indigenous, racialized, and yes, even white. From my essay, the section next moves to the specificity of Black feminist examination of the compounded racism and sexism that female academics face. In her essay, Exposed, the Ivory Towers Code Noir, Delia Douglas of the University of Manitoba speaks to the disregard and marginalization Black women face in the academy. Not just anti-Black racism and not just sexism against Black women, but the imbrication of these into what is now being called misogynoir, or as Douglas prefers, anti-Black gendered racism. Black women constitute 0.7% of the professoriate in Canada, a gross underrepresentation, which is perversely and covertly taken up as proof of the inferiority and unsuitability of Blacks in general and Black women in particular for academic positions. This doubled discrimination, she asserts, is integral to bolstering what she identifies as, quote, contemporary settler colonial enslaved impersonal relations and intellectual hierarchies, end quote. In his philosophical contribution titled The Precariat African Canadian Academic, Ali Abdi of the University of British Columbia speaks to the ways in which the supposedly universal and open Canadian Academy has what he calls the persona africana locked in a perpetual struggle for full inclusion and recognition. To extend Abdi's point, the persona africana is an example of those of us Spivak has identified as, quote, the not quite not citizen of academia. In an approach reminiscent of Stuart Hall's utilization of Antonio Gramsci to speak to Black identity, Awad Ibrahim, University of Ottawa, utilizes Deleuze and Guattari to articulate Black identity. In his contribution titled, What Have Deleuze and Guattari Got to Do with Blackness?, he offers a rhizomatic definition and analysis of Blackness. Importantly, he eschews the colonial frame in order to consider Blackness as a multilingual, multicultural, and multi-ethnic category. The glimpse of this first section of the rich diversity of identities and identifications that make up Black Canadian identity and the complexity of the variety of theoretical approaches we utilize might be somewhat bewildering. And we end the section with a contribution by Gina Tessie of the Université de Québec à Montréal that reminds us that understanding Black Canadian identity, including Black Canadian academic identity, is not a matter of getting one's head around this complexity and diversity. Tessie writes about the fact that in the confluence of French language and Quebecois interculturalism, there is a repression of race and raciology, such that it is in fact virtually impossible to speak Black identity into existence, to be heard and seen as a Black Quebecois subject. Hence the title of her essay, Dancing with Invisibility, Inaudibility, Nuances of Blackness in a Francophone Context. Section 1 therefore starts us off with the nuances and complexities of Black identity and the interpolation of the Black academic into both Blackness and the Canadian Academy. It sets the tone by offering up the Black academic as diverse in its articulation, and it does so with fervor and rigor, and with the caveat of Stuart Hall's now famous Gramscian-derived notion, without guarantees. In short, what we offer in this first section, indeed in the entire text, the nuances of Blackness in the Canadian Academy, is Blackness without guarantees. Thank you. So I'll pass it on to my colleague and co-editor, Dr. Melinda Smith.
Thank you. Tamari will be taking part 2.
Exactly. I'll stand corrected.
See,
will go.
that's the way we did it before. But since you changed, I went with what you said. Okay,
exactly.
So I'll pass it on to my colleague, Tamari Kitosa.
Thank you so much, Hannibal. Thank you so much. And thanks, Awad. And thanks, Lisa, for your work in helping to bring the discussion together and forward. I'd like to begin with acknowledgements, given that I am a professor at Brock University, which is in the Niagara region. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I am at present is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee peoples. I would also like to acknowledge that on these lands, African people not only sought freedom and liberation, but were also, previous to that, were also enslaved on these lands in the Niagara region. So part 2, I want to just center the voices and the perspectives of the contributors, but just very briefly want to describe part 2. It is titled Blackness and Academic Pathways. So the chapters in this section, they draw attention to challenges, contestations, contradictions, and of course, the complicating paradoxes of positionality and situatedness. The section includes a lead-off commentary by Dr. Wisdom Teti, with chapters by Melinda Smith, Carl James, Wesley Critchlow, myself, and the concluding anchoring chapter in the section by Kayan Williams and Gervin Fearon, formerly the president of Brock University, but now the president of George Brown College. Dr. Wisdom Teti's chapter is an analytical commentary and discussion of the key themes and issues explored in the 5 chapters in the section. His contribution is fittingly titled Blackness in the Canadian Academy, Challenges, Contestations, and Contradictions. His commentary not only recapitulates the core themes of the chapters in the section, but he draws on them to meditate on how a genuine commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion can be more than a rhetorical strategy for blackwashing the university. At the same time, he draws on the candid and sophisticated ways that each chapter tells stories of the complex social location of Black academics evidenced by the expectations and pressures of institutional responsibilities and communal demands, which often pull in opposing directions. Crucially, in addition to offering concrete strategies for how to seriously center Blackness at the heart of EDI, Dr. Teti's commentary encourages us to squarely face and transcend the dangers and missteps of Black essentialism, Black complicity with the institutional complacency, and careerist self-aggrandizing allyship. In chapter 6, Dr. Melinda Smith of the University of Calgary titles her essays Hidden Figures, Black Scholars in the Early Canadian Academy. Smith plays with the terms hidden and figures. Her essay challenges the Kantian, Hegelian, and Humean conception of Blackness that negates Black intelligibility while demonstrating that numerical exclusion belies Black intellectuals' vital contributions in Canada. Signaling there's a lack of representation of Black representation in the Canadian Academy, Smith at the same time challenges, resists, and ruptures the single story of Blackness as epistemologically deficit or lacking. The essay is a creative and original epistemic archaeology that recovers a dozen erased Black scholastic trailblazers in pre- and post-Confederation Canadian higher education. The dozen hidden figures Dr. Melinda Smith recovers were not only numerical firsts, they were also figures who made significant contributions to knowledge, public service, and provided philanthropic support to major Canadian universities. And I'm sure Dr. Smith will talk about, I'm hoping, some questions will arise in particular about Queen's University. The second aspect of the term hidden figures is a cheeky commentary that although Black voices in academia are as underrepresented then as they are now, the Black presence in academia highlights the multiplicity and complexity of Black lives. In chapter 7, entitled Committed to Employment Equity, question, Impediments to Obtaining University Appointments, Dr. Carl James posits an impolitic critique of the pro forma equity statements that appear almost as an afterthought of professoriate job ads. The essential question, given the lack of success to increase the numbers of the Black professoriate the past 20 years, is whether these equity statements are trying, as Dr. James puts it, to convince the skeptical reader and potential applicants that the university is truly committed to equitable access and is really a welcoming environment, end quote. Carl posits that the paucity in hiring Black faculty members is driven by the means of neoliberalist discourse of responsibilization, its promotion of competitiveness normed on the ontology and proximity to whiteness, and the myth of color blindness. Crucial to James's analysis is his examination of the ways that, quote, visible minority conceals the exclusion of the Black professoriate within this overly inclusive employment equity category. Chapter 8, written by Dr. Wesley Critchlow, is titled Black Gay Scholar and the Provocation of Promotion. At the heart of this contribution is the recognition, as Wesley puts it, for young Black LGBTQS+ scholars, mentors, and mentoring are at a premium. This is the key point that he emphasizes in this essay. Now, the reasons are twofold. First, the paucity of Black faculty members, and second, an even smaller number of Black faculty members who are LGBTQS+ and openly so. Dr. Critchlow stories his journey toward full professor as a Black gay professor. I draw on Dr. Critchlow's words to sum up the contribution of his chapter. Wesley writes, since most codes and cues for surviving and thriving in academia are heel to toe and ushered in whispers, the arduous apprenticeship for becoming a scholar involves exceptional open secrecy, despite the formal presentation of collegiality, openness, and academic freedom. With so few Black LGBTQS+ scholars to mentor young Black LGBTQS scholars, there is a world of subtlety to academia, not least for PhDs in knowing how to navigate postdocs, job applications, course evaluations, peer interactions, and ways to build documentary evidence for promotion, end quote. Chapter 9, Certain Uncertainty, Phenomenology of an African Canadian Professor, is written by myself, Tamari Kitosa. The chapter argues that it is necessary to resist polarizing constructions of the university and the community, as though both sides of social interaction are coherent and homogeneous. Instead, I posit that in the phenomenology of the Black professor, both town and gown are in dialogue, and that the dialogue is not always harmonious. The contention of the chapter is that when priority rests with principles and values that are clearly articulated, Blackness becomes an expression of the human condition toward which the arc of justice is pursued. Finally, chapter 10, written by Drs. Kayanne Williams of George Brown College and Dr. Gervin Fearon, now president of George Brown College. They offer in their essay, Sociocultural Obligations and the Academic Career, the Dual Expectations Facing Black Canadian Academics. This chapter examines the contradictions, prospects, and realities of expectations fulfilled by Black academics in the context of often opposing demands placed on them by their work in the academy and the Black communities of which they are a part. Drawing on their own experience to navigate social spaces that demand code switching, Williams and Fearon conclude optimistically by noting the following. The building of human capital and drawing on the different components of community social capital, for example, resilience and navigational capital, can assist in overcoming challenges precipitated by a frayed careers trajectory and social economic disparities where race is a significant determinant. This is a wonderful chapter that engages us in how to challenge and resist those sorts of determinants that might undermine the careers of Black academics. And I'll turn the floor over to my colleague, Melinda.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are joining us. Thank you for joining us for this launch, and thank you, Awad, for and University of Ottawa team for hosting this event. I'm speaking to you from Treaty 7 territory. I'm at the University of Calgary, which Treaty 7 territory. I'm located in southern Alberta, and University of Calgary is also the city of Calgary is also homeland to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. I'm also speaking to you from Calgary, which many of you know is part of not just my chapter contribute to Hidden Figures. I also think the story of Calgary, in terms of and of Alberta, in terms of the Black presence, is often obscured in many narratives about Canada, including the so-called Black pioneers who have been here over a century. And have been part of some of the leading and trailblazing civil rights cases from the 1940s and earlier that are still not widely known across Canada. So I actually think that's important. We also speak in the context of the UN Decade for People of African Descent, 2015 to 2024. And again, we can also speak to the extent to which this book emerges and in the context of a still not widely marked moment in Canada. So the chapters I'm going to speak to are in part 3, and that part 3 of the book is entitled Blackness, a Complicated Canadian Story. These chapters lead up with a section by Dr. Annette Henry, who's a professor of education at University of British Columbia. And it's important to highlight not just these sections, but all the chapters, which are, I think, from almost 30 scholars who are in over universities across Canada and around the world, reflect the diversity and complexity of the Black population in Canada and also in the Canadian Academy. And so before I go into Dr. Henry's comment, I just want to highlight that because it speaks to the importance of this book and also the chapters. So in this section, we talk about a complicated story. That complicated story is marked by the diversity and complexity of the Black population in Canada, which is often reduced to a skin stereotype. We know, for example, that the Black population has been here since the 1600s, currently 1.2 million Canadians. 2016 census to 2021 census data will be out later in the fall. So it's over 3.5% of the Canadian population, but also 15.6% of the visible or racialized minority population. And 12% of that population considers themselves mixed race or mixed race. Overall, younger than the Canadian population, and also slightly more women than men. 50% see themselves as immigrant permanent residents. Most since the 2010 are from the African continent. Before that, they were from the Caribbean, from places like Jamaica and Haiti. Currently from Nigeria and Somalia and Cameroon, Democratic Republic of the Congo. Over 170 different places of birth, over 200 ethnic or cultural origins, 28% speak French as a first language. That complexity cannot be reduced to skin stereotype. And this book highlights that. Dr. Henry, in her opening comment, begins with a mediation on the ontological, or the be, belonging of the Black state of being in Canada. The sense in which we are both unexpected, as Dr. Hannah Wright put it, but also made to feel out of place, anomalous. Where are you from? Well, everywhere. And we are here. And we've been here for centuries. It highlights white normativity, which aims to set limits to Black flourishing, deficit thinking, tyranny of low expectations, which we continue to unsettle. And they highlight more than the skin deep, disrupt the idea of Eurocentrism as if white associated with achievement, and also highlight the important need to continue to have conversations about the ways in which systemic racism circumscribe and white fragility or white discomfort circumscribe Black possibilities. The questions in this chapter differently explore questions, as Henry puts, that are blunt, curt, clipped, presuppositions that slips off the tongue, that function too under the white gaze to suggest the Black presence is anomalous, if not dangerous. They suggest, as you see in racial profiling on campuses, they suggest we do not belong, we are out of place, that they can modify and dehumanize, set limits to where we are, should be, can be from. As Dr. Batek at Queen's University put it. They also explore the white epistemic view of knowledge, how the world works. Eurocentric epistemology frames Black knowledges and ways of knowing as out of place, as not relevant. And so in these chapters, in the word of Mohawk scholar Audra Simpson, they refuse this way of the predominantly white academy, tries to circumscribe our lives, possibilities, try to force us to justify or research, teaching, scholarship, our presence, even our humanity. They highlight how, although we were never meant to survive, in the words of Audre Lorde, we engage in self-help and we continue to thrive and excel. The 5 chapters are by Fitting In, Fitting Out by Dr. Henry Daniel, who is a professor at SFU. The Caged Bird Sings in Harmony, the Academy Spoken Word Poetry and the Making of Commodity by Dr. Emmanuel Tabi at McGill University. States of Being, the Poet, a Scholar, a Black African and Diasporic Woman by Dr. Julianne Okot Batek at Queen's University. Intersectionality and Blackface, where post-racial meets Black feminism, nationalism meets Black feminism by Delise Mugabo, who is at University of Ottawa, and Respecialization, the Black Boundaries of Belonging, the Subversive Blackness of Muslim Women, John Therese Mendez, who is at university in Norway. I highlight the scholars and the places they are located because they reflect this diversity and complexity that are so important to the complicated story of part 3. Fitting in and fitting out by Henry Daniel highlights, I think, reminds us of the importance of the Black body, the performativity. It highlights the Black body and the performance of Blackness and offers the intersections of the poetic and the political in the encounter as a Black academic. And in this case, Dr. Daniel highlights the implications for being a dean in a faculty. Chapter 12, The Caged Bird Sings, in Harmony, the Academy Spoken Word Poetry and the Making of Community. Dr. Tabby talks to the importance of localized knowledges and scholarship and the struggle to speak the specificities of the languages of the Academy, particularly when you think of for new scholars, first-generation scholars, and the particularities of that language, how it circumscribes. Here the Academy is a place of predominantly written, but Black scholars, like Indigenous scholars who are talking about oral histories, are disrupting that. In this case, Black scholars are disrupting that with, for example, spoken word poetry, which challenges, disrupts, resists efforts to circumscribe Black knowledges. Julianne Okot-Patek, States of Being, highlights the performative, as does Henry Daniel and Tabby. In her poetry, powerful poetry, Dr. Okot-Patek highlights the situatedness and groundedness of her self-understanding and what it means in terms of the intersections of Blackness, gender, and diaspora. Again, that diversity and complexity of the Black life, not only in Canada, but in the Academy broadly. And that's also true for the final 2 chapters in this section by Dr. Mugabo, which highlights intersectionality in Blackface. And I think that's important. We have post-racial nationalism and Black feminism, speaking to the specificity of the Black life and Black experience for Black women under Quebec nationalism, and the ways in which that circumscribes the very idea, not only of Blackness, but also of feminism. And so, and she writes, who talks about who in Francophone Canada owns Black studies and Black feminism. And we can, again, in question period, talk to the ways in which emerging out of Quebec is that whole push around the experiences of Black women, hijabis, or the experiences of Black women who, in relation to white feminism and their sense of belonging in such a space. To be surprising to many, Mugabo contends white Francophone nationalist feminism benefits the most from Black feminism and intersectionality studies, paradoxically. Even our knowledges are appropriated to uplift others. And finally, in chapter 15, Respatializing the Boundaries of Belonging, the subversive Blackness of Black Muslim women, again, highlighting the intersectionality of race, religion, or the racialization of religion of women in Quebec. John Therese Mendez examines how Muslim women's claim to a Black selfhood and that diasporic experiences makes them feel like they are perpetually out of place, as again gesturing to the comments, the unexpected, as Dr. Wright highlights, and the sense of unbelonging, as Dr. Henry highlights. So that's the contributions I want to make to this piece, this section, and now I turn the floor over to Dr. Awad.
To me.
Yeah, Abraham. Yeah.
Thank you, Melinda. I appreciate that. You could feel. I hope you're getting the feel of the book so far. The overarching question of the book, and probably for all of us to, as a epistemological question to think about, is what happens when the unexpected shows up? What happens when the unexpected is Black body which finds itself in a nice place like the Canadian Academy. Part 4 of the book answers this question by drawing on the African indigenous conception of time that imagine coherence and unity in the dialectic of past and future. Shirley Ann Tate opens this section by drawing on the politics of affect. And that's a central concept to this section by way of drawing by way of answering the question, what happens when the unexpected shows up. In her opening essay, she attempts, Shirley attempts to answer this question. What does it mean to feel the wholeness of one's Black humanity against suffering and self-negation, even while we as Black scholars speak our agency with and through suffering and self-negation? Probably, and I really mean this, I'm not going to spoil it for you because this is a wonderful place. Even if you're buying the book, I would highly recommend you go to that section and go backward and forth. So I invite you to, I'm not going to spoil it and tease more from the opening of the section, but I really invite you to read her opening remarks for this section. Again, following Melinda's suggestion of locating people located at York University, the York Collective, which is a group of graduate students, pushes York to embody and put Black studies into practice, not just talk about it. And again, referring back to Sarah Ahmed's idea that the talking sometimes do away with the actual practice. So in her chapter, which follows the York Collective, Dolores Mullings shows the impact of microaggression from white students. What happens when the professor is Black and students are white, who either do not like or not want their beliefs to be challenged? At the intersection of Blackness and feminism, that question becomes ever more urgent and complicated. Following that chapter and similar to it, Omisor Dryden makes the bold argument that university might talk the talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion, but EDI hasn't disrupted anti-Black racism. So we need to think harder about why that is the case. Dryden's argument is supported by Jennifer Kelly's chapter, which builds on Kelly's administrative position. Given that we function in neoliberal institutions like universities, Kelly radically argues, neoliberalism actually embraces racism. Let me just say that one more time. Neoliberalism actually, and this is Kelly's argument, embraces racism. This is a point of discussion that we can have in the discussion. Built around radical love, Adele Blackett's chapter, Adele of McGill University, calls for alliance between Black scholars. Here, our work is turned into an act of radical love for our Black communities. Barrington Walker follows Blackett and engages with Black Lives Matter from a history perspective as a historian. Again, different places, different fields, and this is meant purposefully done. Barrington, Black Lives Matter is appreciated and critically engaged with in this chapter. The final chapter of this section, and hence the book, is by Melinda Smith, where we have what in my own qualification of it, one of the most comprehensive surveys of Canadian higher education in order to map out the presence and the absence in the Black presence and absence in the Canadian academy. When it comes to Black faculty, students, and administrators, and Black studies, clearly this is a substantial conclusion that Smith had reached. We have some serious work to do, and we are located, after all, in Ottawa U, and clearly there's some serious work to do. As we do that, Smith reminds us we should resist whiteness and the oppressive homogenizing of anti-Blackness and create enabling spaces for Black multiplicity. I hope you got the perspective of the four sections of the chapter. I'm going to ask the presenters. I'm going to ask Nomboso to do her comments, followed by Gina, and then open it up for. I'm going to ask the presenters to come on camera, and then we'll be happy to receive the comments and discussions. So Nomboso, do you want to start first? Nomboso, can you hear me? If not, I think she's here. I see that she is. I hope she's.
I'm trying to unmute.
It would help.
And I'm trying to get my video, so.
That would be amazing.
Can you see me? I can't see myself. I don't know what's happened. Forgive me.
And you're looking
you can
good.
See me, and you can hear me too? Okay. All right. It doesn't matter that I can't see myself. That's okay. I think it's my screen. I have this new computer, and I'm still learning how to do it. Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Ibrahim, and everybody else for joining in and for the beautiful, again, work that this book really presents. It is a rich manuscript that every time when I try, like I was trying today to say, okay, what am I going to say? Because there are so many components and aspects of the book that I find very interesting, very educative for me, and also very complex. So every time I pick up the book and I'm like, okay, so today, what is it that I'm learning? I find I'm always learning something new. It's something, so I encourage anyone who hasn't picked it up, or who perhaps like me has picked it up and is reading bits and pieces at a time, never all at once, to actually just keep thinking about the number of questions that the book actually brings forth. So for me, as I was looking through it again today, I wrote some questions for myself. So looking at all these sections, one of the questions that came up for me was, if being in the academy is so complex, so challenging at the same time, complex, challenging, and rewarding, is it that the rewards are higher than the complexities and the forms of spirit murder that are described in this volume? I asked, why do we keep on? Why do we stay on given the complexities? What is it that is personal about us? What are the personal rewards, gains that we bring forth? But more importantly, what are the political advantages that we see in staying and doing this work. I think all of you probably, Dr. Melinda, Dr. Handel, and Awad, and everybody else who's taken up an administrative position at the university knows that doing administration sometimes take away from being in the classroom per se, because then the classroom time gets reduced. I don't know in other universities, but I do know at York that that's really what happens. I am Nombuso Dlamini, by the way. I'm at York University, and I was the inaugural Gino Castin Chair in education in the new urban environment. Sorry, I forgot to introduce myself, but that is okay. So I was talking, when I was looking at the book, asking this question about what sustains us, what sustains Blackness, our Blackness in the academy. I couldn't answer it for myself, and perhaps I would like all of you who have contributed in the chapter to actually say or talk about what is it that sustains us. The second takeaway that I actually always return to for myself is the fact that I also, by reading this book, I'm learning new things. And so why is it that I didn't know, let me say, perhaps from the chapters that I've read, why is it that I didn't know at least 70% of the material that's in the book? And I consider myself very well read. Actually, I consider myself more read than most people. So why is it that I did not have the knowledge that I actually get from the book? This is content, I mean, not the politics per se, but the content of what is offered by some of the chapters in this volume. Why is it that that's not really visible? So that's another takeaway that I ask myself, and how can I actually change this for the students that I work with in the classroom? And another important takeaway, which I'm going to close with because I do not want to take too much time, as there is a common question and answer period that we need to be cognizant of and attend to the questions that are coming in right now. My final takeaway has to do with the generation that we're working with. I have students who come to my classroom and say, Dr. Dlamini, we only came to your class because we've never had a Black professor throughout our career, our studies. We've never been taught by someone who's not like us. In coming to my class, so there is that real expression of the expected, right? And I'm thinking about the question you asked, Awad, what happens when the unexpected shows up? But I find myself as a Black professor being now the expected, or the person who students want to go to because they've never had this Blackness in front of them. Now, what happens once they are in my class, it's a different narrative, it's a different story, how they either embrace me or embrace themselves in knowing me, or challenge me in not knowing me. So I've heard students who come and quote mainly white professors. We were taught by Professor Pearl Smith. I've never not gotten A in my classes. I'm an A student. So in other words, who are you to think that you can actually give me anything less than that which real professors have given me, all of whom are white and male? So my takeaway, or a point from which I encourage us to think about is do we see a difference in this present generation, in the way in which they embrace or not, talk or not, engage or not with Blackness, the Black identity in the academy? Do we see a difference? Is this difference worthy tapping on, working with in order to be able to push our politicalness and our academicness and our presence in a space that doesn't really welcome us? Is there a generational thing? Are younger people much more open-minded? Are they more critical of what's been going on, or are they still really performing in ways that are much more sophisticated than their predecessors? So those are the kinds of questions and takeaways that I came up with this particular time in trying to prepare for today's session. And I really thank everybody for each and every word that was put in this work, in this manuscript. I thank the editors, Melinda and Handel, for working with the contributors to take their words and reshape them to make them ours and everybody else's, because that's a very big job to have undertaken. You're using and taking, modifying, molding other people's words to create a manuscript of this sophistication. So thank you everybody. I'll stop there and pass it on to Gina. Gina, it's so good to see you. I haven't seen you in years.
Thank you, Nambuso. Thank you, dear.
Thank you, Nambuso. I'm glad to see you too and see you all. I'm Gina Tizi. I hope that you hear me well. I'm Gina Tizi. I'm a professor at University of Quebec in Montreal, and I'm also the chair of the UNESCO Chair in Democracy, Global Citizenship and Transformative Education. I would like to thank so much, warmly, the 4 editors of the book for inviting me to share reflection with you today, and previously to inviting me to be a part, to write a chapter in this wonderful book. And I'm so proud to have a chapter in this book, because I'm so proud to be in the company of so inspiring colleagues. I would like to acknowledge that here in Montreal, we are in a First Nations territory where many First Nations have been meeting and living for centuries and centuries ago. I would like to acknowledge also that we are here in a continent territory, called America, but America is the colonial name. According to, in relation to Amerigo Vespucci, an Italian. But the First Nation name is Abya Yala, Abya Yala. So I would like to acknowledge that we are in this colonial America, but really we are on a continent called Abya Yala by the First Nations, namely close to the Panama, close to the country, Panama. So my chapter is about the impossible dance with being invisible and inaudible within the academy, French Academy. And I'm talking from the Quebec, la province de Québec, la belle province de Québec, from a francophone context. My university is a francophone university. And as you may know, Quebec is a kind of political, cultural, and linguistic, very special linguistic context. I hope I won't hurt anyone, but Quebec is a kind of, there is a kind of schizophrenia here, political and cultural schizophrenia about being a majority, linguistic majority, within a minority in Quebec, within a linguistic minority within Canada itself. And this schizophrenia leads to complex situation for Black people in the francophone context. So my own Blackness is intersects with being a woman and being a Francophone. So the Francophonie, it's a kind of another dimension in this intersectionality of being Black, of being woman, and of being a Francophone. The French context, it's about the language, the French language. My chapter is, and the situation, the whole situation of being researchers, of being teaching, learning, and researching in the Francophone context. It's about the coloniality of this language. I think that all other languages, they have their own coloniality aspect, but French has a very strong coloniality. This coloniality, this matrix of power, and matrix power and coloniality of power, but also coloniality of knowledge. And it's all about the work, our work in the academy. It's about knowledge. But in French, we face a strong coloniality of knowledge. Language, it's at the heart of our academic activity. Language is about theories, the theoretical frameworks we use. Language is about the concept we use. The concepts, they are keys of our work. They are keys of our the social transformations that we propose and our own individual and also collective emancipation. Concepts matter. They are about the transformation and emancipation. So when the French language confiscates those concepts, let's say race, let's say racism, let's say racialization, let's say woke, let's say wokeism, all those concepts which are keys for us are confiscated by the French language, by especially in the academy. We don't have the right to use those concepts. So we cannot use the keys to open the doors for our emancipation. So we cannot use the keys, so we have to build those keys before to be able to use them. And when we do so, we can build them, or we can, let's say, use other keys from you guys, in the Anglophone context, we have to face the social representation of irrationality. We have to fight against the tentative of being negated, the negation of ourselves, Black woman, Francophone, using, talking, writing, researching from a social critical perspective. We have to fight against invalidation in the academy. And being invalidated in the academy, it's the worst thing that we could face. In terms of this concept of irrationality, you know that being woman, it's associated with irrationality. Being a Black woman, irrationality, and being a Black woman, Francophone, from a perspective, from critical perspective, within the Blackness thinking, it's like a full trade of irrationality. Irrationality, it's not an innocent social representation for Black women. Yes, Awad? Yes.
2 more minutes. Okay.
Thank you, Awad. Irrationality, it's about not being intelligent. So if you are not, if you face this social representation of not being intelligent, so what are you doing in the academy? So you're not supposed to be there. So we have to fight against that. That's why in my chapter, I talk about the maroon epistemology, the maroon hermeneutics, the maroon coming from my ancestors in Haiti, slaves who were escaping the plantations in order to be free. And the maroon epistemology, the maroon hermeneutics, it's about flying to be present and in some time absent. from the academy, flying the academy in order to be able to think critically about our concept, our theoretical framework. So French biologist Albert Jacquard say, we don't see the world with our eyes, we see the world with our concepts. So you can imagine like what the French language is doing to Black people in the academy by confiscating their concepts. So I have a dream, like you know who. I have a dream of this wonderful book will be translated in French, not in 20 years, not in 10, and not in 5 years, but please, the editors, translate this book in French right away. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gina. That's that's the next project that we all need to work on. So I invite Melinda Nambuso Handel to come on the screen. And I know we were offered a few questions by Nambuso. We can start with that, and people, please feel free to raise your hand if you would like to ask a question. Otherwise, you can always chat, pose your questions on online, and Lisa will monitor that, and so will I. So with that in mind, I don't know if anybody has an urgent question. Sheila is asking, is there an electronic copy of the book? Yes, there is one through the University of Toronto Press.
Perhaps I can start us off. I mean, thanks, Gina, and thanks, Nambuso. Gina, every time I hear you speak, I mean, it's so eloquent and so important. What we too often leave out of the discussions is the element of the difference that the Francophone world makes to the work that we do. But in the way that you take it up, I'm always grateful to you for really, I mean, we talked about these complexities as this one is this one is that. And then when you put it all together and you speak about being a woman and being Francophone and being immigrant also, you did not mention today, but that I've heard you speak about that. It really brings out the complexity, not only the complexity of identity, but as I try to say it in my quick take on your essay, almost the impossibility of articulation, the impossibility of being. That is the kind of discrimination that is way beyond what it is that we're speaking of in the Anglophone world. And the importance of language and what can be done with language. When you say we can make it up, I mean, Melinda is from the Caribbean. Look at what people can do if you take away their language and you give them this other, and you say, this is the only language you can work with. I give you English and nothing else. Well, look at where reggae, look at where Creoles, look at what can come about if you give people only, say, this is all I can give you, right? So you're lending an aspect to the struggle that I think is really wonderful for us to continue to consider, which exists maybe in the Anglophone world, but is really hyper in the way it's taken up in the Francophone sense. So I really want to thank you for your contribution. Nambuso, as usual, I think you have managed to ask us about 12 unanswerable questions in the time that you took to, and you said this was one or two things. But the one thing I want to pick up on, there's several things, wonderful things that you asked, but one thing I want to pick up on from what you raised, Nambuso, is the kind of, why do this? Because you asked, well, what are the rewards? You asked other things, what are the political advantages? What sustains us? But I want to go back to that fundamental question that he asked, which is, why do this? And all of us have had to make very serious decisions about career, about whether to continue to be in academia, in this neoliberal academia. So many people have decided to leave academia because it's so problematic, right? To the extent that the Brits even have a term for it, quit lit, the literature that is growing on people who are quitting academia, and in a very serious way. So the question comes to us, how are you going to be in the academy? I look at somebody like Melinda, I look at people like Annette, people who not only stayed in the academy, but say, I will go for an administrative position. I always believe that any serious academic who goes for an administrative position is really doing a huge service for the rest of us. Because there's not much you gain out of being an administrator. I never went that far. I'm not going to go that far as to go into administration, but that in-between space of I will be in that space. So do we opt to do our work and ignore the problems of the academy, ignore the racism, etc.? That's one stance. Another stance is, do we complain about it and write about it and theorize about it? That's a second stance. A third stance is, do we get in there, roll up our sleeves, and actually try to get some of the work done, which then exposes us to, oh, you have been co-opted, etc., right? So we have to make very deliberate choices, I believe. There's no innocent way to be Black in the academy. So take your pick of how you're going to be in the academy. All of us have made certain decisions about what we're going to do. And I just want to thank both of you for very stimulating thoughts about the work that we're doing collectively. Thank you.
There is no innocent way of being Black in the academy. Okay, that's the title of the next book. I don't know if Melinda or Tamari would like to chime in. Or anyone else has questions. It would help to unmute.
I would love to hear other people's comments,
Yeah.
even comments if they don't have questions about the book or what they have heard. It would be fantastic, and if they would turn on cameras too, that would be even great.
The silence of the lamb.
Oh man, okay, that's fine. Let's let me offer 2 cents. Oh, Tamari is unmuted. Go ahead, Tamari.
Oh, thank you, Melinda. I wanted to follow up, not so much with a comment or feedback myself, but to follow up from Nambuso raising a number of questions. And as she was speaking about reading these chapters, and each chapter offers a different perspective, a different angle, I've been thinking quite seriously, and I think she's given me permission to think about it in the context of a question. What sort of questions and conversations are we not having right now about Blackness in the academy, right? What's the next step for us? Because we're at this moment where I think, based on what I'm reading, based on what I'm hearing, we're at a transformative moment of the university. This fully neoliberal enterprise where, as Handel points out, some people are quitting because it is absolutely brutal work in a culture that's anti-intellectual, that's reverting to a kind of like a crass utilitarianism. If you can't get a job from it, then we're going to cut sociology departments. We're going to cut philosophy. We're going to cut area studies because the Russians are not the enemies, or the Soviet Union is not the enemy anymore. So we don't need area studies. Like, there's this rationalization taking place. And we're now talking about block hires of Black faculty into a university now that's burning. based on the question that I have for any university right now is, have you read your ethics guidelines, for example, from the Tri-Council policy around coercing people to do things with their bodies that they do not want to do? How can we talk about increasing Black faculty in the university when there's a slave narrative being imposed where academic freedom, freedom of expression, freedom of speech is now contingent upon saying what the administration, what the government wants to hear? We're not debating anymore. We're just fundamentally treating the production of knowledge as saying what people want to hear. Otherwise, it's conspiracy theory, it's impolitic speech. If I were entering the university now as a Black faculty member and being told that I have to do something to my body in order to eat, I wouldn't do it. So are we missing conversations right now? Not so much missing them, but is there another level that we can and should be going now that we've opened up space, like Nambusa was saying, and Gina saying, like talking about concepts. We don't see with our eyes, we see with concepts. Is there something happening right now that conceptually we don't have a vocabulary for?
Great question. I'm sure Melinda has the answer for it. Just kidding, just kidding, just kidding.
I don't have the answers, but I actually think those are important and salient and timely questions. And I'm glad I'm glad Tamari raised them, because I think they're key. And I would also add to, just if I can add another angle to what Tamari posed in terms of this. When I was at SFU recently, someone asked me the question, what's the difference between being a scholar or an academic, doing research or talking about or critiquing this work, the academy, and then being in administration? Well, one of the first things someone said to me was, maybe in the first week, you don't have academic freedom. And I'm like, so administrators, because they're in a way of a kind of cabinet solidarity, your speech is circumscribed. Well, if more of us move into if there are limited numbers of us in the academy, 0.7% women, for example, who are professors, and we move into administration, that limits the opportunity. Yes, we can create spaces, we can ask, or we can help craft, say, cluster hires, or help transform Black studies, or transition year programs. But there's also a limit to that, right? How are they transformed? How are they created? And we are inviting people to take Carl James's point, welcoming them into what? As Tamari raised. So I say the EDI in my title, these are as a scholar, these are question marks. They're not given, they're contested, and they need to remain contested. Inclusion into what? An untransformed system and structure that can create lateral violences, microaggressions, cultures and climates of exclusion, tyranny of low expectations. So it seems to me it is a kind of this in-between position has its own limits. And when there are few of you, I'm the only Black person in leadership in my institution. I'm not unique in this sense across Canada. It begs the question, what are we gaining, what are we losing by moving into such spaces? So I have taken the position that I'm going to speak, because as Audre Lorde says, we were never meant to survive. And if that speech means some implications for my position, then so be it. I am, first and foremost, the hardest thing I ever earned was a PhD, and then tenure, and then promotion to full. Those are something that nobody can take those away from me or any Black person. And so leadership to me is as a consequence of having done that heavy lifting and peer reviewed. And my view is a neoliberal university pushes away from understanding the academic, the scholarly, the intellectual labor, and the communities that supported us in getting here. Administration can sometimes circumscribe that. So I think we need to be true to ourselves and remain attached to communities. Otherwise, we lose ourselves, and I'm not sure what we gain. So those are important questions that both Handel and Tamari, comments that Handel and Tamari make, and I think we need to have these conversations publicly. To the point that Tamari made, what questions and comments we're not making. I'll make a final comment, Awad. I think we are having parallel conversations. I see this on social media, for example. I took on a title that says EDI in it, okay? And all of a sudden, I stopped being a political scientist. I stopped being a social science scholar. Of course not. But it seems to me the assumption is made sometimes when you move into these positions that you lose your critical self. And maybe that's the case for some people. But is that what we want it to be? So what do we need to do to ensure that people, when they get in these positions, they remain accountable? If we actually distance ourselves from that, we give them free rein to be unaccountable, or we give them free rein not to thrive. And it seems to me that kind of conversation about can we do leadership differently? That is a conversation we absolutely need to have. Otherwise we lose our souls. It is a conversation we need to have, which is why I insist on doing my research, applying for ethics. To Mari's case, if I apply for ethics, I have to be consistent with research ethics. I continue to write, I have to be consistent with research ethics. Many who stop doing that, what are they consistent with? So we need to ask those questions, but this is our universities, our colleges, our institutes. What do we want them to look like so that Black people can flourish? Which is the forum that Handel is organizing coming up this weekend. So Handel, you should speak to that too.
There is a question in the chat, and if the speakers could please discuss a bit on the disjoint between university diversity regulations and practice, and looking into why migrant faculty members of color are not afforded the same opportunities as white faculty members, despite diversity regulations in hiring. Do you want me to read that again? Okay.
I think we got that question. I don't know if Melinda or Handel or Tamari has, if you have, if you want to chime in, and I see a comment also, activist leadership is needed. So please go ahead. Yeah.
Just briefly, okay. So I mean, and I cite here D.L. Stewart's article on the language of appeasement, and my view is the language, and this is Gina Teres. I think your comment about the language, the vocabulary, the importance of these in terms of what they enable and what they don't enable, the limiting sense in which EDI can limit open spaces, but mostly it can limit. And D.L. Stewart talks about the language of appeasement. And as despite my title, I don't have a problem with these kinds of critique. I think they are urgently needed. So, and this is part of the issue. What does diversity do and who does it benefit? In Canada, for 35 years, we've had employment equity. It has benefited primarily white women. That's not just a kind of a throwaway comment. All the evidence point to that direction. The secondly thing is, but if you don't have data, including disaggregated data on the experiences of Black faculty, which we include in the nuances of Blackness. If you don't have the data, you can't track the experiences. And not just the data in terms of numbers, but the data, the qualitative data, the storytelling that's necessary to understand the lived experiences in the academy. We see all the stories of profiling, right, and on campus. So I believe that it is actually an anti-equity act, an anti-diversity act for institutions not to collect and publicly release data. I see that as enabling an environment in which we can talk and tell nice stories without necessarily establishing that the experiences of Black people and racialized people and Indigenous peoples are improving. And when I look at the data, I actually see either static or reversal. I want to repeat that, static or reversal. Even despite the rhetoric, the number and the cluster hires, there aren't changes because you can hire 10 Black faculty, but the numbers of other groups going up are also exponential. So nothing is changing in terms of the representational dynamic. So we have to critique that. Instead, I find people distancing themselves from these initiatives, which gives free rein for institutions to tell the stories they want without being accountable, providing the data to show changes, substantive changes being made. So I know Tamari has written some brilliant stuff on this, and I hope he speaks to it.
And I'm also mindful of the time, so if you can just take 1 or 2 minutes, and then we close with that.
Thanks, Melinda. I think you're giving me way too much credit. I think you're the one, like that articulation. I think that's key to addressing Shaylee's question. And it makes me think about Joel Covell's concept of meta-racism. So again, there's a concept that helps us to think through the way that formalized language policies actually help to disable the very intention of the policies itself. And it's internally contradictory, but I think it behooves us to think very explicitly about like what Melinda is saying. She's in this position, right, taking a very activist stance because she has not stopped being an academic who raises questions. And the questions speak to the policies, right? Where do these policies come from? What sorts of teeth do they have? What sorts of metrics are behind them? And what sort of data sustains them? And I think that to me is one of the key things that I'm glad to hear Melinda say that that's what she's doing, because very often when you look at public policies or any policy, it's not driven by data. It's driven by emotion and various types of political rhetoric based on assumptions. So I think that the work that Melinda is doing in the chapters that she's written for this book, but also in an ongoing way, what she's doing is signaling to others that if you want to take up administration, look at the data, set benchmarks, and then have meaningful conversations with people about what's at stake. Because there's some people that are resistant, in part because emotionally, personally, there's something at stake for them, which is inarticulated. And I think we need to have that conversation where people can talk about what is their investment. And then that leads us to the points that Gina was talking about, using conceptions. And then back to Nambuso's points about the complexity of these conversations, that we should be able to sit with each other and have conversations about it, even those people that might object. I'm not certain if that helps to answer the point.
Yeah. Okay, if I could add a final point, just the other side of what Melinda brought up and how you spoke to it so well, Tamari, is there's also a cost which comes all the way back to that beginning point. There's a cost of all of this, and we know people who have served, maybe even just as head of department, who in the end gave that up or were kicked out. So Melinda is, in a way, she's doing great work, but she's also a canary in the mines. Is change going to happen, or is she going to be pushed out in a way as not being the right kind of administrator? Because she's right. You're coming into that and you're being brought into a certain kind of way, a certain kind of stance, right? So the term, Gina's point is so well taken. And it's not just about the concepts, but what the concepts mean for how we do what it is that we do. So when people take things like inclusion for granted, what does it mean to move beyond that kind of idea of bringing people in, including them, without changing the culture of the institution, without bringing about real justice and representation? What is the culture of the university? Are we doing assimilation when we bring people in? It's about bringing people in, assimilating them into a system which is not good for us, and so more of us are part of that system. I don't want just more of us. I want the institutions to change. And that's part of what it will be going on this weekend. I'm going to send out invites to a bunch of you who I haven't invited yet, because out of those national dialogues that happen at Wisdom 30 and others instituted at the University of Toronto, Scarborough, has come out the Scarborough Charter, which lots of presidents were very happy to sign on to. But now we're beginning to say, where does the rubber hit the road? So Melinda and Wisdom and others are bringing people together at the University of British Columbia to say, let's have actual meetings of these presidents and let's know what it is that people are actually doing. And I've organized, and part of what I did was to say, there's so few of us, 1% of British Columbia is Black, right? We're getting close to 1.4% or something. I've teamed up with SFU, and we're going to do a symposium about Black flourishing. I love the term that came out of that Scarborough Charter. Not just Black inclusion, but Black flourishing is what we should be aiming at. And I've designed that symposium so that it's about Black folks who are students, faculty, staff, and also community folks talking about what it means that we can do Black flourishing. And so these presidents will have to hear that apart from their own meetings. And these are some of the ways that we have to make interventions with the positions that we come to that can make a difference, because we have to make a difference. Otherwise, we cannot live in these institutions in the way in which they are organized. They were never organized for us.
And hence, coming back to the question of what happens when the unexpected shows up. So clearly what the speaker, all of them, and including Gina and Nambuso, are alluding to the distinction that we all need to make, and I'm going to make this as a final comment, between being poets and being strong poets. And this is a distinction that I kind of been thinking about quite a bit. Quite a number of my colleagues are brilliant scholars in terms of how needing to know, knowing how the system works, how to read, write, and publish, and get all the accolades for you to move up the ladder and everything else. But very few of those are, I would qualify quite a number of my colleagues, and I'm generalizing here, are poets. They know how to read, write, and everything else, but there are few moments, few people who come in with a particular vision, and not only a vision, but they also know how to articulate those visions. And I would qualify those as strong poets. If my colleagues allow me, I think quite a number of contributions that were made in the book were strong poetry. And I highly recommend you thinking with them, reading with them, and I hope you got a teaser of the essence of the book through the discussion that we just had. I'll be more than happy to send out the flyer that Handel just mentioned, but I would, as a hip hop scholar, and through Zoom, we don't usually clap in hip hop. We snap our fingers, and so I'm snapping my fingers to all of you, to the audience who made it through the an hour and a half, and I'm profoundly thankful to Dr. Archibald, who's a member of the ELN. Lisa, you've been quite wonderful in hosting the event. The event will be available on YouTube once the taping is finished, and I will be more than happy to forward it to people. So thank you, Gina, thank you, Nambuso, thank you, Melinda, thank you, Tamari, thank you so very much, Handel, and all of you for being here. I hope you got a taste of, and we tease you to buy the book. So, and in the chat, there is a link to University of Toronto Press's flyer to the book. So thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everybody. And snap your fingers.